service is a Meditech software, which is employed extensively throughout North America.
The honourable member from Annapolis.
Thank you. One of the things that I guess maybe you could answer is, in my riding, there's a company called Tech.
Order.
You say moment of interruption.
Moment of interruption.
Ron? Reached the moment of interruption. Honourable member for Halifax Citadel. Honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to have an opportunity to speak to this resolution regarding rural economic development. I have lived in a rural area of Nova Scotia for 13 generations, and my son and his son make 15 generations. I believe in rural Nova Scotia. Our party has put together a comprehensive package of initiatives that we believe will stimulate our rural economies and keep them growing for future more generations to come. Our party has listened to the concerns of rural business, and we understand the frustration that they must feel when you try to take your products to market or try to attract customers to your business. The crumbling infrastructure in rural Nova Scotia places an unfair burden on you and in many cases discourages investment in the first place. Unfortunately, the government and the NDP have seemed to have forgotten about the rural Nova Scotia. Their thoughts seem to be focused on the big city. Mr. Speaker, I remember back in October when I put forward a resolution that recognizes the problem of rural depopulation, and it was voted down. It was very disturbing that other members of this House would not support my resolution. No wonder the people I represent feel like the forgotten people of rural Nova Scotia. Since 1996, 13 of Nova Scotia's 18 counties saw their population drop, and rural depopulation is still one of the greatest impediments to economic growth. It means there are fewer economic opportunities, and it means our young people are being forced to leave, to come to the city, and the cities all across this country. We are losing one of the greatest resources to other provinces. Mr. Speaker, Digby County has lost 5% of its population, and Annapolis County has lost 2.5%, and it's continuing to depopulate. This cannot continue. It is a situation that needs to be addressed by all parties and all levels of government. The lack of attention to rural economic development is hurting all of Nova Scotia and not just rural areas. We learned yesterday from Statistics Canada that the province has experienced the slowest economic growth since 1996. How can that be, Mr. Speaker? I'll tell you how. Our young people are leaving this province, and our growth is stagnant, if not in decline. To grow this province, we need to grow our population. I thought those $155 checks were going to grow the economy, but a lot of parents gave them to their children to help them get to Alberta. The economy did not grow, Mr. Speaker. It just helped get rid of more of our greatest resource. Nova Scotia had the worst economic growth of any province in Canada last year because this government has forgotten about the economic development in our rural areas. Back in 1999 and 2000, Nova Scotia saw the greatest growth in a generation, and it's been downhill ever since. Because the city is full to capacity, and now they are leaving the province for greater chances to find work. Economic development growth has not had any impact on rural Nova Scotia. More must be done. I have talked to grandparents who are also moving west for the fear of never seeing their grandchildren again. People in rural Nova Scotia need to know that we care about this problem. They need to know that we care about keeping some of our young people home. They need to know that government is paying attention so they will have hope for rural Nova Scotia. What has the government's response been? There is no response. The government gutted the Department of Economic Development, and the results are showing today. Government is not investing in infrastructure. Even the 101 from Weymouth to Digby is not controlled access highway, and the forgotten people there feel that it never will be. 20 the 101 is important, but in some places there is no controlled access highway. And this only shows rural Nova Scotia that doubling the roads into the city is top priority, nothing less. How can businesses rely on transportation infrastructure to get their goods to market when there is a substandard infrastructure in place in the rural areas? Government is not paying enough attention to the needs of agriculture or the fishery. Farmers and fishermen are out there in the rural areas living in a threatened life. A lot of them feel it's just a matter of time before they are finished off by governments. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is that this government has not recognized the problem of rural Nova Scotia and what it means to the people who live there. Before we can work on a solution, we must all recognize the problem facing this province, especially rural Nova Scotia. Once that is done, government should, without delay, appoint a Minister of Rural Economic Development and put together one of the best rural economic development teams this province can find to work and make our province grow. And then that'll be the day when we see our province prosper. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize the Honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise and make a few comments and share my time with my colleague from Kings North and have the opportunity to say a few words on what is a very important issue, and certainly coming from a rural area of our province, Mr. Speaker, I feel quite strongly about this issue. And of course, I have a bit different views on this topic than perhaps the previous speaker had, and perhaps understandably so. But I represent an area, Mr. Speaker, in Cape Breton Island, which tends to come up in this House quite a bit, and which runs from Port Hawkesbury right to the northern tip of Cape Breton, about 3 hours in length, and is very diverse, not only in its geography, but also in our culture and our heritage. But what I was reminded of when I was listening to the member speak about the doom and gloom of perhaps what the members of the third party are seeing, I see it in a much different light. When I drive into my riding, Mr. Speaker, and I go across the causeway and I drive towards Port Hawkesbury, I drive into a town which the front sign on the town is "Believe It." That's what it says. It says "Believe It." And there's a photo of a new civic center going up in our area. And to me, that speaks of the attitude that is happening right now in the Port Hawkesbury and the Strait area, certainly in that part of my riding. And I know an area which affects Richmond, Guysborough, and Antigonish. And there are many positive things happening in that area. Why, Mr. Speaker? Why? Because we have, I believe, a provincial government who is working with our local community. Why? Because the federal government is also working with local area. Our municipalities of the various Strait areas are working together, including that of the town of Port Hawkesbury. And there really is a can-do attitude with our Chamber of Commerce and our RDA. Whether it's the Civic Centre, which we have invested in, the Justice Centre, which is currently going up, the expansion at Store Forest Industries for the TMP plant, Ocean Nutrition, which is having record growth, and in fact the official opening just last week, Mr. Speaker, the Superport activity, EDS call center, which does have some challenges, but if you look at our area, 5 years ago, under the previous government, 6 years ago, sorry, Mr. Speaker. Compared to today, there is no comparison what is happening in certainly my riding and my part of Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. But it's much more than just seeing some of those investments. We have to focus very diversely on what we're doing. The community college is another example. We have an expansion happening there in the Strait area, 80 new spaces being created. And it's part of the $125 million expansion which is happening right across our province. In order to grow the economy, in order to provide the skilled workforce that we need to make investments right across the board in our education, also in working with our local RDAs and working with our small businesses. And I respect that there is issues in that member's particular riding, and I face many of the same issues because I see many people having to leave our local area and moving away. And there are challenges. But, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, there are many ways to address that. I think back in 1993 when the previous government came in, and we were after making in this province, the previous 6-7 years before that, a major investment in highway infrastructure between the areas of Port Hastings to Port Hood. Well, funny enough, Mr. Speaker, there was a lot of talk about what we refer to as the missing link, a very important part of highway infrastructure. That important piece of highway infrastructure was neglected for 6 full years, Mr. Speaker, under the previous government, but that changed. In 1999, when my colleague, the Minister of Transportation, came, he recognized the need to make an investment there. It wasn't done in 1 year, it was done over 3 years, and I realize my time is getting cut short soon. But, Mr. Speaker, my colleague recognized the need for an investment there. That is the type of investment we need to see in rural Nova Scotia if we want to keep young people home. It is more than just businesses, it's infrastructure, it's water and sewer projects, many other aspects. And, Mr. Speaker, I realize my time's getting short. I'm going to share the rest with my colleague, the member from Kings North, and I will hand it over to him. Thanks.
Thank you. The member for Kings North.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I too want to thank the member from Digby Annapolis for bringing forth the issue of economic development in the rural areas and the issue of rural depopulation. I remember reading, quite a few years ago now, Alvin Toffler's book, The Third Wave, where he's a futurologist, and he was predicting that in the future, rather than concentration in urban centers, that because of the new technology, we'd be depopulating the urban centers and populating the periphery. Some of that's come true, but it hasn't materialized to the level he expected. And on a national level, indeed on a global level, the city I grew up in Bolivia, when I left in the 70s, had 500,000, now is 1,500,000 as the rural area moves into the urban area. So it is an issue that he raises, and certainly one that concerns me as a member for a rural riding. But what I want to challenge the first speaker, the member for Digby Annapolis, and his colleagues who've spoken on this important issue, is that there's something very important that they can do as individuals and as a caucus to help in the economic development of the rural riding that I represent. And that is to lobby with their federal counterparts, particularly MP Robert Thibault and the Liberal MP for Kings Hants, Scott Bryson, in order to ensure funding for the 101. They may not be aware right now, but one of the reasons why I worked so hard starting in 1999 for twinning of the 101 and for upgrades beyond that to the area represented by the honourable member was not simply because of safety. That was predominant, of course. We were losing many, many lives along that section because of the lack of twinning. But it also, I realized with the demise of the railway, that in order to have the economic linkage into the city, that we needed a twinned highway. And so there were two reasons why we pushed this issue. I pushed this issue very, very strongly. When I met with the then leader of the third party, now premier of the province, thankfully, he asked me what the #1 issue was in 1999 that I was concerned about, and one of them was, along with agriculture, was the twinning of the 101 for reasons of safety, but also for reasons of economic development. And I'm a little worried right now because the highway is going to Avonport, but the federal government to date has refused to come in and reach some sort of memorandum of understanding to continue the next session. When the Minister of Transportation, the Honourable Tony Valeri, was here, I went to the announcement expecting when they opened the first section of the 101 that he would then announce that they'd entered into agreement with the provincial government to continue the next session from Avonport on to Colebrook and then beyond that, but there was no announcement, none at all. It was a bit disappointing. I was very glad to see him in the area, glad to see the focus. I made sure that various people asked him and Mr. Bryson questions that would put them on the record as saying that they were in favor of moving the twinning to the Colebrook and then moving on with interchange upgrades and passing lanes. So at least they're on the record, but that's all we have so far. So if the honourable members from the Liberal caucus want to do something to help rural development in Kings County and Annapolis counties and county that the member represents, then please do something besides bringing forth these resolutions in the House. Do something that you can, lobby with your federal brothers and sisters and get some real action on moving the 101 forward. Instead of leaving it where it is, you have the opportunity now, instead of empty rhetoric from Mr. Thibeault and Mr. Bryson, let's have some action, let's have some concrete action on moving the 101 forward from Avonport, and that will help rural development in Kings County, that will help rural development in Annapolis County, that will help rural development in Digby County, and that will be a real driver for economic development. Because you know with the Twin Highway, when it goes forward, the highway's upgraded, that you'll be able to have the transportation linkage into Halifax. So let's see it happen. Let's use the muscle that you have with your federal counterparts. Let's lobby with your other members and let's get this thing going, because right now the federal government is doing nothing beyond Avonport. They have not come to the table, and we'd like to see them come to the table, because I believe in rural development. I believe in what you're talking about, and I think that a twinned 101 will help rural development in my county and in your counties. So let's get going, and let's work with both these MPs to see it done. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize all member for Pictou West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and being a member from rural Nova Scotia as well, I certainly welcome this opportunity to have a few minutes to speak about economic and demographic challenges that we're facing in this province. And I want to thank the member from, from Halifax Citadel that introduced the resolution and brought forward by the member from Digby Annapolis. And it reads, "Therefore it be resolved that the government has failed to address the economic and demographic challenges faced by rural Nova Scotians." And certainly I agree with what some of the information that's been given by all members here who have spoken this evening on this challenge that's faced here in Nova Scotia. And there's really two parts to the resolution. One is on demographics and the other is on economic. So the word demographics, Mr. Speaker, I looked up a definition of it, and it means refers to the characteristics that describe a population and changes that take place within that population. And as we all know, in rural Nova Scotia, there's certainly some changes going on with our demographics and changing populations throughout Nova Scotia. And I want to refer, Mr. Speaker, to this report. It's called Painting the Landscape of Rural Nova Scotia, and it's been put out by the Coastal Communities Network and some folks from Dalhousie University. And in it, there's a number of interesting facts that refer to rural Nova Scotia and how the demographics is changing. It mentions, for example, that depending on how you define rural, between 60 and 75% of Nova Scotia's total population lives in the rural area. And really it's only Halifax, Dartmouth, and Bedford that you might consider urban in this province, and anything outside of that core really is rural Nova Scotia. So that means small towns like Kentville or Pictou or Port Hawkesbury, Truro, even though they're 10 or 12,000 people, really they're in rural Nova Scotia. In the report also it mentions that since 1986 the population has increased in the core area of Halifax and it has decreased in the rest of the province. In rural Nova Scotia the average age is higher than in urban areas and it's increasing. Just some interesting facts from the report. It also mentions that between 1991 and 2001, there was a 9% decrease in young people, that's between the ages of 15 and 24, in rural Nova Scotia, with substantial variation across the province and amongst the regions. And there's also an income gap between urban and rural Nova Scotia, and certainly in the rural parts of this province, the income average is lower than in metro, and it's also lower than most rural areas across Canada. So we're in many ways the poorest of the poor. And Nova Scotia overall is considered more rural than Canada as a whole, and it's more rural than most other provinces across this country. So we're sort of in a unique situation in Nova Scotia in that 60 to 75% of our population is considered rural, and that's a much higher percentage than really most parts of Canada. Also mentioned in this report is the counties in our province that are declining. 13 out of 18 counties in Nova Scotia are on the decline, and I guess the most prominent amongst those are counties like Richmond and Cape Breton, and perhaps the worst decline has been in the county of Guysborough. Now, in the county that I come from, Pictou County, our population also has declined since 1986. At that time, we had a population of 50,700 people, and by 2002, that was down to just over 49,180. So we've lost well over 1,500 people during that time period, and that may still be declining. Of course, it's our young people that are leaving that's causing that depopulation. Some are coming here to Metro, and some are going to other provinces, other territories across the country. So obviously the demographics of rural Nova Scotia is changing, and as the resolution said, this government has failed to address the challenges that are occurring in rural Nova Scotia. The other part of the resolution, Mr. Speaker, is concerned about economics, and there's some interesting facts also from this report, and I will table these when I'm finished my remarks here, Mr. Speaker. On the economy in rural Nova Scotia, our unemployment rates are substantially higher than the national average for rural areas. It also mentions that in the fishery, the number of people employed in the fishery has been decreasing, even though the total value of the commercial fishery is up, and there's higher landings but less people employed. And I know one factor that could really help keep our fishing community strong in rural Nova Scotia would be to make sure that the fleet separation policy and the owner-operator policy under the DFO program is enforced, is regulated, is allowed to continue. Certainly we have a number of young fishing fish harvesters that are having difficulty getting capital, and they're turning to processors who will lend them the money, and really it should be private money that's available either through banks or credit unions or maybe through the Nova Scotia Fisheries Loan Board, but young fishermen are having difficulty accessing that money, and so what is happening is that we're getting trust agreements between young fishermen and fish processors that's tying up the relationship between the owner-operator and the fish processor. So that's bad when that happens, and I think it hurts rural communities. It's more important to keep fishing families strong and to keep fish boats and gear and licenses in the hands of the families in the coastal communities, and not allow it to become vertically integrated into the large fish packers. It also mentions, Mr. Speaker, that the farm debt has been greater than farm receipts in Nova Scotia since 1998, and the gap between the two is widening. Certainly in rural Nova Scotia, the farming agricultural community is very important, and in the part of the province that I come from, agriculture is an important component of our rural community, and with the recent difficulties that beef farmers have been facing, it's even more important than ever that government put an economic investment into our agricultural communities and allow, again, farm families to remain strong. And when that happens, our rural economy is going to thrive and not only survive but thrive. And finally, Mr. Speaker, it mentions in here that tourism contributes to the rural Nova Scotia economy and is subject to periods of growth and decline depending on factors such as weather and such as international political conflict. I certainly agree with that, but I think what it doesn't mention is that tourism is also very much affected by the condition of our rural infrastructure and especially our rural roads. And I'm going to speak for that on a minute, but I will table these documents, Mr. Speaker, and there you go. But I want to talk about how tourism is affected by the lack of investment in our rural roads. And I've spoke previously in the House here, Mr. Speaker, on how Stoneham chalets in Scotsburn are affected by the very poor roads. There's been a number of complaints received by tourism operators calling the roads atrocious, that we'd be better off with gravel roads. In this case, Jeff Gunn operates Stoneham Chalets and has said that good transportation is crucial to the industry, and he wants to make his business a year-round industry. And I think by investing in our rural infrastructure, we could be increasing the economy in rural Nova Scotia and creating more jobs, not less. I guess my time is drawing to a close, Mr. Speaker, but basically I think government has got to continue to invest in rural Nova Scotia, invest in our primary industries like farming and fishing and forestry, and by investing in our rural communities and investing in our rural families, we have a much stronger Nova Scotia. And so this resolution has some truth to it, and I think we've got to turn it around by investing in the types of infrastructure that I have mentioned. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. There's approximately 4 minutes left, which would belong to the Liberal Party, if there's a member there who would like to take advantage of it. The honourable member for Preston, it's in regards to, do you have a copy of the resolution? The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you very much. Rural economic development is a very important issue for me. You look at the rural areas, and a lot of rural areas have very little opportunity for employment. There's usually no big companies there. There's no big employers unless they're resource-based, and we know what the resource-based industry has been in Nova Scotia. But in order to develop and create economic development in rural areas, you need the infrastructure in place. Now, I don't mean that you need very big factories to support some small businesses. I mean you need things in place such as high-speed internet now. You need convenient transportation systems, so that's a good road, and the roads are an issue in the province, as everybody knows. And you need other things such as cell phone service, all the things you need to run a business on a day-to-day basis, that if you live in the regional municipality here or in Cape Breton regional municipality are just taken for granted. But if you live in a small rural area where you don't have those services, it's really impossible to do business. I recall years ago a friend of mine had a small business, and he moved it from the eastern shore into Porter's Lake. Now, he's still in the rural area, but Porter's Lake, at least every time he picked the phone up and called a supplier in Burnside, it wasn't a long-distance phone call. Every time he had to go and pick something up, it wasn't an hour's trip one way, it was a 15-minute trip. It made a big difference, and that's the type of infrastructure you have to have in the rural areas to make sure that things happen efficiently. So you need a good transportation system and good suppliers that can bring you products that you don't have to travel a long distance to get it if you're a manufacturer. And we also have to target the industries that don't need heavy equipment moved around, more things you can do with technology, and you have to encourage that, and you have to encourage that and keep our young people in the areas, in the rural areas, because there's no better place to live than rural Nova Scotia. See, the lifestyle that you can get here and have in rural Nova Scotia is second to none. But if you can't earn a living there, it just simply doesn't work. And you see so many young people leaving Nova Scotia, going to Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver, Alberta, and we're losing our brightest and best talent that are going to mean that the jobs of the future aren't going to be here. The jobs are going to be in other places that we can't afford to have them. We've got to have the young people here. We've got to encourage them to stay here, and we've got to make sure they do stay here. And most of all, if we can get them to stay in the rural areas and work in the rural areas to build a base of knowledge and technology, well, without that, you've got to have the services. I remember years ago trying to get a bank machine in Sheet Harbour when I was the MLA for Eastern Shore, and it was a major accomplishment because that meant that tourists could come in town, go to the bank, and get some money out to spend at a local restaurant or whatever it was. That was before you had the Interact cards and all those things happened. We did get that, we made it happen, and it made a difference in the community. Thank goodness now we have Interact cards, we have all that convenient system that's in place that electronically you can get funds almost any place and you can spend money any place in the tourism industry. And the tourism industry is also a vital factor in the rural economic development of rural areas. We get such an area, you can take an area that is beautiful area.
Order, please. I think the time has expired on the late debate. I'd like to thank the members for taking part in the debate. The House will now resolve itself into a committee on supply.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, looking in the budget speech on page 14, talks about that 94% of Nova Scotians have doctors. So therefore 6%, and that 6%, Madam Chair, is 56,000 Nova Scotians don't have doctors. I know in our riding of Clare, there's many people that don't have doctors, and when you look at many communities throughout rural Nova Scotia, you see there's a number of communities looking for family doctors. I know in Clare about 5 years ago, Dr. Leslie Griffin, who was practicing in Clare at the time, decided to return back to further his studies. A position then became available for, I think the position has been open now for 5 years. Yet, in those 5 years, we haven't heard much during that time, except when Dr. Barbara O'Neill, late last summer, was in Digby County looking at starting up a practice. At the time, there was an opening in Weymouth, which is a neighboring community of Clare, and she was also looking at Clare. So, looking back at those last 5 years, you know, there was very little said or done by the provincial government to try to help recruit a doctor for the people of Clare. In the end, she decided to open a practice in Weymouth where Dr. Felix Doucet had retired and passed away. So the fact that she went to Clare, to Weymouth rather, many people in the Clare area were very pleased because right now in Clare there's a number of residents going to the community of Weymouth to see their family doctor. In the community of Weymouth, we have two doctors right there at the given time, Dr. Don Wesby and Dr. Barbara O'Neill. I guess my first question to the Minister is looking at those last 5 years when an opening for a family physician for the Clare area, I'm just wondering or curious what the department did in that 5-year period to try to fill that position for the people of Clare.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I thank the honourable member for the question. I haven't obviously been here for the last 5 years, but perhaps I can speak in some general terms and that may address some of the concerns of the honourable member. We are actively pursuing incentives with respect to attracting doctors to rural locations through moving expenses. We have some alternate funding programs that are in place and debt reduction programs for as part of the incentive package. I have on previous occasions spoken about some of the change in the approach of the medical schools with respect to how they're training physicians. And the medical schools have realized or come to a realization that they place a great deal of emphasis on acute care. And as a result, people graduating from those medical schools sort of have an orientation toward a practice that focuses around acute care as opposed to the traditional rural GP attitude. I understand that the curriculum is being adjusted so that there is a broader approach relative to the training of physicians, and that should have an impact to have people graduating from medical school that are not so focused in a particular direction, so that hopefully some of those people would look at rural practice as being an opportunity for them. So that that's a cultural thing that will have an impact as a result of the adjustment in the training practices. I understand also that we provide incentives for the training of one doctor in Quebec at French-speaking medical schools, and that is going to be amount is going to be increased, so it will go from 1 to 2. Now, again, I recognize that that's not addressing the honourable member's immediate concern, but it is part of what is out there in terms of trying to address this whole question of rural practices being more attractive to practitioners throughout the province.
The Honourable Liberal Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, in the budget speech last Thursday, the government talked about a renewed effort to recruit doctors, particularly for rural Nova Scotia. I'm just wondering if the minister could explain if the government is proposing to do something differently with recruiting doctors for many rural communities.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The major focus will be centered around some of the change in practice that we would employ in rural Nova Scotia, with the increased emphasis on nurse practitioners and the role that they play in enhancing recruitment in rural Nova Scotia. We're also aggressively pursuing attracting people through alternate funding programs as a means of attracting physicians to rural Nova Scotia, so that if they come under an alternate funding program, they do not have to think in terms of establishing the practice or moving into an area where they would have some doubt as to whether there's sufficient population to be able to support their practice if they can look at a guaranteed level of income then it is something that works to their advantage. So that is a tool that we are employing and want to expand the use of that particular tool to attract doctors to rural Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Liberal Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to just focus a little bit on the medical graduates. Could the minister indicate how many medical students do graduate every year, and how many of those graduates decides to remain and work in Nova Scotia? I don't know if the minister has that information, but let's hear.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The capacity of the medical school is that it graduated 82 physicians last year. And we have, of course, in the last 2 years, have increased that by 8. That is those going into the medical school, so that in whatever they work 4 years, when they work their way through, then it will go up to 90 graduates from the medical school. But you have to appreciate that the medical school serves, of course, all of Atlantic Canada and, of course, students from beyond the borders of Atlantic Canada. So I can tell you that we have, I believe, 51 additional physicians working in Nova Scotia this year as opposed to last year. Now, what I can't tell you is how that breaks out relative to the 82, how many of them are Nova Scotians. We would try and get that detail and provide it for you, though.
The Honourable Liberal Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've been told, according to the Canadian Medical Association, the acceptable numbers of patients for a rural doctor is between 1,600 and 2,000 patients. So, and I'll come back to why I'm asking this question. I want to find out if this is correct or if it's within that range. Madam Chair, many of the doctors in Clare and in the neighboring community of Weymouth have large practices. I know of one doctor that has over 4,000 patients. I know of one that has, I know 2 doctors that have over 3,000 patients. So I know the fact that we have currently 2 positions available in our area right now. Doctors are trying to provide a service to, especially to the people that don't have doctors. Yes. And what I'm hearing practically every day is there's a lot of concerns from the residents that if the government does not hurry up with recruiting, many people believe they're going to actually lose their doctor. These doctors have heavy loads, long hours, maybe near burnt out. So many residents are expressing concerns for the well-being of these family physicians. So I'm trying to find out if there is such a scale for rural practice, if the number of patients technically allowed, I guess, is between 1,600 and 2,000 patients for a rural physician. Is that the case? I'm just curious.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The numbers that the honourable member were referring to would be higher than the average number. And the average number is approximately 1 to 1,200 in the province. But that number is lower in urban areas and tends to be higher in rural areas. Now that would account for some of the increased numbers that he has, but it would appear that those numbers are larger than the norm. And because that is, that's part of the situation where we heard stories earlier today of one doctor retiring and requiring two to replace the doctor because the patient load was so heavy, and people that are setting up a modern practice are choosing to place more emphasis on family and lifestyle and not take on so many patients. That for that reason we require two physicians to be able to replace those doctors, and that is why we accept that there needs to be aggressive policies with respect to attracting doctors to rural parts of the province. That is why we need to change the model of practice. We need to employ nurse practitioners. We need to employ the concept of clinics so that we can have doctors make a decision to move to rural parts of this province and not feel that they're going to be subjected to a large, 7-day-a-week practice without any relief. And that is what needs to be addressed as we move forward. And it's with that in mind that we are employing the recruiting strategies that we are, and using the concept of nurse practitioners in order to be able to achieve that. But it is a challenge, and we're continuing to make it a priority.
The Honourable Liberal Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That completes my questions to the Minister. I want to thank the Minister for answering those questions. I want to yield the floor to my colleague from Annapolis. I understand there's still maybe a little bit of time for one more question. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Member from Annapolis.
I just wanted to go back to the last question that I asked you, Mr. Minister, regarding the Nova Scotia Health Information System. I'm curious about the company that is providing the service. When we would be looking out of province for a company to provide a health information system, when there's one in my riding in Lawrencetown which is providing health information system around the world to governments, why its own government would not be using it to provide that service?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There was a request for proposals with respect to that competition. It was an open competition, and the company that won received the contract based on the results of that competition. And I can point out, Madam Chair, that they have extensive experience in providing this type of service internationally, and especially in North America.
The Honourable Member from Annapolis.
Madam Chair, I just want to, I think government at all times should be recognizing, when you're looking at businesses in Nova Scotia, that we should be recognizing that when there's something wrong with that system, they're here to put it in place. Plus, you're employing Nova Scotians. But at that, I'd like to end comments from our caucus and thank the Minister and his staff for allowing us the opportunity to question him.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I understand that I now have an opportunity for concluding comments. What time? 5 minutes? It's those that know me know that it's a great challenge for me to speak for 5 minutes, but I'll do my best, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to extend my appreciation to all members of the committee for their questions and for the very legitimate concerns that they have brought forward on behalf of all Nova Scotians. I hope that we have been able to provide as much information as we could with respect to answering those questions. That is what this process is all about. It's part of the accountability of government to the people of the province. And there were some specific questions that were asked of us. We will undertake to get the answers to those, and I will table them in the course of the session, so that that information will be available to members who asked. I also want to express my appreciation to the staff of the Department of Health in the great amount of work that goes into preparing estimates. And again, the fact that they have to do that on an annual basis points to the fact that there is an accountability process. But when you look at the work that goes into the preparation of a document such as this, you have some appreciation of the fact that there is a great deal of work went into it, but also of the fact that there's a great deal of accountability associated with the operation of the department, and we were very pleased to be able to come forward and defend these estimates. Madam Chair, we should not lose sight of the fact that if I'm winding up here, when we're dealing with my estimates, it is not just the estimate for the Department of Health, but also for the Nova Scotia Seniors Secretariat. So we want to make certain that that estimate gets called. I don't want to lose sight of that. I'm sorry? Well, well, we're. I guess I'm getting to that stage where I might be starting to be considered an expert based on experience rather than just responsibility. So we'll, as I said, undertake to provide the answers that are required. And again, I want to thank members of the committee for their pursuit of these estimates. This is a stage in the process where it's appropriate to be kind, Madam Chair. Especially when you're looking at the clock winding down to the last of the time frame. I've enjoyed the experience. It certainly is, as members who have had ministerial responsibilities know, it is a time when you really get a judge or an assessment of how well you know your own department, and I was rather pleased with what I was able to do here today. So well, thank you. But I also know that there's more work to be done in that regard, and I look forward to doing it. So if that is the time, Madam Chair, I want to thank members for their participation.
Shall Resolution E9 stand? And Resolution E29? The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Yes, Madam Chair, I move that your committee do now rise, report considerable progress, and beg leave to sit again on a future date.
To supply reports.
Begs leave to sit again.
Is it agreed? Agreed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Please call the order of business public bills for second reading.
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 62, the Financial Measures 2004 Act.
Bill number 62. Honourable Member for Halifax, Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will just ask the Speaker to let me know. I think I have a rough idea of how much time I have, but perhaps you could let me know so I could time my remarks accordingly. Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I think I'll just begin in any event, and you can let me know as I go on. Mr. Speaker, last time that I rose on this bill, the Financial Measures 2004 Act, was on Tuesday, and I was talking about some of the themes in the Act and some of the problematic parts of this particular bill. As it is every year, Mr. Speaker, the Financial Measures Act is an omnibus bill. It contains a large number of provisions having nothing to do with each other. The theory of the Financial Measures Act being it's all the statutory changes made necessary by the budget, and to a large extent,
That's what it is, but there are a number of provisions that do not belong in this Financial Measures Act. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I missed the time.
32 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much.
31 now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had spoken about, as I left off the other day, I was talking about some of the pension changes in the bill and how that is one example of provisions that do not belong in this act. They weren't announced in the budget, they weren't part of the budget, they don't affect the budget. There's some of the pension changes that don't even apply to the province's own pension funds, and yet we find them in the in the Financial Measures Act. What are they doing here? These are pensions. Anything to do with pensions is bound to be complex and technical, and with an absolute minimum of background information. And not just a minimum of explanation, but no explanation from the minister about what they're for, what the implications are, who's affected, who stands to win and who stands to lose. We find a number of changes to Nova Scotia's pension laws here in the Financial Measures Act. That's where I left off the other day, Mr. Speaker, and what I'd like to move on to now is to talk about the portion of the Financial Measures Act dealing with the Provincial Finance Act, and that, for the members on the other side who are carefully following along my remarks, that's Part 15 of the Financial Measures Act. Now, there is a provision in there that is very good. The public accounts are now going to be required to be delivered earlier than they have been in previous years. They're now going to be required to be delivered by September 30th instead of by December 31st, and that's a good thing, bearing in mind that the fiscal year ends on March 31st. But the government has a continuing problem with reporting from governmental agencies. And although the province's own accounts have to now be delivered earlier and in a more timely way, every member of this legislature knows that many annual reports and financial statements are delivered to this House after, in many cases, not just a few cases, but in many cases after a full year or more has elapsed. Sometimes annual reports are tabled in this House and have been just very recently within the past week, covering more than 1 year, covering up to 3 or 4 years, Mr. Speaker. And that kind of information is the next best thing to useless in this House. And to deliver to MLAs information relating to the conduct of the agency 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. And so the government has a great deal of work to do to pull up its socks on this score. And it's good to see in the Financial Measures Act that the government is imposing that discipline on itself by requiring that the public accounts, which are, in other words, the province's year-end financial statements, now have to be delivered by September 30th. But then we get to the portion of the Financial Measures Act dealing with the Debt Retirement Fund, the much ballyhooed Debt Retirement Fund, Mr. Speaker. So ballyhooed that the last Minister of Finance, last June, in the lead up to an election, everybody knew an election was coming, and just a few weeks before the call, the last Minister of Finance marched into the Red Room, the most ornate chamber in the House, and he had a row of flags behind him, and he had the screens, and he had all the visuals in place announcing that Nova Scotia was finally going to have a debt retirement fund. Good news, you would think, Mr. Speaker, and I suppose the thought's good, but that's pretty much all the government did on the subject because, well, I have two thoughts on the Debt Retirement Fund that is contained in the Financial Measures Act, Mr. Speaker. And the first thought is this, and this was revealed to us by the Auditor General in his extraordinary special report of November 14th last year, and that is that when that Minister of Finance marched into the Red Room last year to announce his debt retirement fund, he was using figures that he knew at the time were wrong. He knew that he was understating the province's debt by $500 million. And it was in a news release 2 weeks later, on a Friday afternoon, before the July long weekend, less than a week before the election was called, that the government owned up to the real debt figure. So, Mr. Speaker, that's a serious matter, and I don't think we should underplay it. This province's Minister of Finance, not the current incumbent, but the last incumbent, walked into a news conference on the eve of an election with a debt retirement plan based on a figure that that minister knew at the time to be wrong.
Shame.
Mr. Speaker. That's my first thought, the debt retirement fund that's contained in this Financial Measures Act. And my second thought is this: it's all just for show. It's all just for show. It doesn't actually accomplish anything. And when we ask finance officials, why would you take the money and put it in a separate fund, which then is used later to pay down the debt? Why would you do that rather than just paying off the debt directly? And you know what, Mr. Speaker? They have no answer. There is no good answer to that question, because the two, it amounts to the same thing. Why don't they just take the money that they're putting into the debt retirement fund so it can, it can earn some interest, and that they're going to use then to pay down the debt a few years from now? Why don't they just pay it this year directly and save money, the interest payments on the debt? It is the same thing. And it doesn't matter what the last Minister of Finance say, it doesn't matter what this Minister of Finance says, there is no difference. The only difference is show. The only difference, what it amounts to is what you might call a restricted surplus. It's like a mandatory surplus. You have to have a surplus of this amount every year, and it can be used for only one purpose, which is to put it into the fund. But it's all just for show, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't actually make any difference than if they just took the money that's going in the fund and paid it directly on the debt. So, if Nova Scotians feel that something is being done about their debt, and that last June's news conference and this year's budget, that they're actually getting somewhere and paying down this enormous debt, I'm afraid they're mistaken. And it's too bad. Because that is one of the biggest things holding us back as a province, as a legislature, in doing what we're elected to do on behalf of the people who elected us, is this mountain of debt that we had. And Mr. Speaker, I never miss an opportunity, and I don't think this House should ever forget where the debt came from. The debt was created by a Conservative government. It was created almost entirely in the 80s by the Buchanan Conservative government that year after year after year ran large deficits. And Mr. Speaker, we all know, and we say it so often in this House that it becomes almost a cliche, that the debt we run up today has to be paid off by our children and our grandchildren. And, you know, we just have to look at the fact that the debt that we're struggling with today was run up 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And did any of the politicians sitting in this House at that time think about who was going to pay for it? Well, you know what, Mr. Speaker? We now know it's us. We are paying for it every day that we struggle to pay for health care, every day we struggle to pay for a quality education system, or to have quality roads that will help boost our economy, or any of the other things this government does. The reason why we struggle so hard to find the money to do that is because the mountain of debt that John Buchanan and his governments ran up. And we should never forget where it came from. Now, when the Liberals were elected in 1993, they tried for a little while. They tried for a little while to rein it in, but it didn't work very well, and they didn't try very hard. And by the time 1997 rolled around, well, they got rid of their leader. They were a new leader, and boy, oh boy, that debt just took right off again. Mr. Speaker, you should see the charts. Under the Buchanan years, it goes up sharply, still going up under Savage, but leveling off a little bit. And then under McClellan, back up to going sharply. And this crowd, they put the brakes on it again, but still going up. It's still going up. They haven't stopped it. They haven't reversed it. They've only stopped the rate of growth at which the debt is growing. And their answer to that is this debt retirement fund, which is just for show. We have a debt of over $12 billion. $12 billion. 1, 2, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 dollars. And this government is segregating $6 million and putting it off in a fund and saying, hey, look what we're doing about our debt. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, what do we save when we put money aside on the debt? We save, on average, about 7% of whatever we put aside. Because that's, roughly speaking, the average interest rate that we pay in our debt. So if you take $6 million that we're putting aside this year, and you multiply that by 7%, you get $420,000. $420,000 a year is what we're saving. And as has been pointed out in the health estimates, Mr. Speaker, the healthcare system will eat that up in, if I'm not misquoting the figures, in less than 2 hours. You know, that's the small amount of money that this government is actually saving with their debt retirement fund. So, Mr. Speaker, let me move on then to a part of the Act that I was hoping to spend more time on, but in a different way. And that's Part 16 of the Act, the bit dealing with the Public Service Act. Why was I hoping to spend time on it in a different way? Well, because this government introduced it in the House as a standalone bill, Bill 45. Now, you know, I've been saying throughout my remarks on the Financial Measures Act that there are a number of provisions in this Act that do not belong in this bill because they have nothing to do with the budget. And if anybody in this House wants a proof, just look at the provisions of this bill dealing with the public service. How do I know it doesn't belong here? Because it was already introduced in the House as a standalone bill before the budget. It has nothing to do with the budget. This is the provision about firing CEOs of organizations that don't do what the government tells them to do. So I'd like to spend a bit of time on that, Mr. Speaker, because as a member of this legislature, I had the right to stand on second reading and talk on that bill and explain why it is so misguided. But some bright spark somewhere in government decided that the way they were going to get this controversial provision through was to slam it into the Financial Measures Act where it did not belong in order that it would get passed without it skipping right over the controversy that the government anticipated if they'd actually called Bill 45 for debate. So since I'm being denied the opportunity to speak to second reading of Bill 45, I'm going to essentially give my second reading speech here in the provision on the Financial Measures Act. Because, Mr. Speaker, the provisions of the Financial Measures Act that I'm talking about are identical to Bill 45. This is not something that's approximately the same as Bill 45 or borrows some ideas from Bill 45. It is exactly the same words. And it has been buried here in the Financial Measures Act where it doesn't belong. This is a very peculiar bill. It has nothing to do with finance. What it does is it changes the province's employment law. Because what it does is it designates, it deems, to use the lawyer's word, it deems certain actions on the part of certain people to be firing offenses. And by definition, they wouldn't be firing offenses otherwise, because if they were already firing offenses, you wouldn't need a law deeming them to be firing offenses. Okay, so these are things which, by definition, if somebody did them today, they couldn't be fired for. So what's being changed is the province's employment law. And as if that's not peculiar enough, It is directed at people that the province doesn't employ. These are people who have employment contracts not with the province of Nova Scotia, but with other public agencies like school boards, district health authorities, and all of the dozens of other government units that are out there. Yes, they're part of the public sector, but the province has set these agencies up as standalone agencies for a reason, Mr. Speaker. And it is those agencies that employ these people. It is those people who do the searches, those people who do the hiring process, those people who write or negotiate the terms of employment, and it's those people who sign the contracts of employment. And the province is coming in and saying, whatever your contract says, we reserve the right to fire the person that you've hired because we don't like what they're doing. Mr. Speaker, that's very strange, to say the least. The province is giving itself the right to fire people for something that's not currently a firing offenses, people that the province doesn't employ. Now, the natural question would be, does the province have the support of the organizations that actually employ these people? Well, it appears from media reports that the answer is no. This game is a complete surprise to them. They have no idea what the government's getting at here because they weren't consulted. So the province, which doesn't employ these people, and without any consultation with the real employer, is saying they reserve the right to fire somebody for what? As if this bill's not bizarre enough, it doesn't even specify what the firing offense is. Because 3 years ago, when this crowd had their majority government and they could do whatever they want, and they did do whatever they wanted, they passed a bill called the Government Restructuring Act. And we said at the time, we'll say again today, the government gave itself powers that were far too broad, that were disrespectful of this legislature because it gave them powers to do things that ought to go through this legislature. And one of them was they gave themselves the power to issue this thing called an administrative directive. Well, what is that, Mr. Speaker? Is it a law? No, it's not a law because it doesn't go through this House. Is it a regulation? No, it's not a regulation because there's a process for enacting a regulation. You know, public scrutiny, public comment, they have to be published, all that kind of stuff. No, it's not that. It's something else again. They created a whole new category of thing that people have to obey, but doesn't have to be passed through the regular legal process. The minister can just wake up one morning, sign an administrative directive, and everybody that applies to has to follow it. Sounds a bit like something a Roman emperor would do, doesn't it? They just said, I've decided there's going to be this new law, and I'm going to sign it, and from that day forward, everybody has to follow it. There's a reason, Mr. Speaker, we have a legislature, and that is because the laws deserve to be debated and passed upon by people elected by the citizens of the province. That's why we're here. But the government gave itself the power to issue these administrative directives, and it is for breach of one of these administrative directives that CEOs of these government agencies can now be fired. What is it that a CEO has to do to be fired? We don't know. We don't know because it's not in the bill, it's not in the Financial Measures Act, it's not in any of the material the government has issued around this bill. We don't know. It can be whatever the government chooses it to be. Now, one of the things that the minister said, or was in one of the media briefings from the government, was that, well, you know, if a CEO does something financially not in compliance with generally accepted accounting principles, that would be a firing offense. The problem, of course, is that there are other government directives that are not themselves in compliance with generally accepted accounting principles. Do the members on that side know, for example, that if municipalities and school board follow the rules laid down for them by this government, the accounting manuals laid down by this government, they will not be in compliance with generally accepted accounting principles? The Department of Education has an accounting manual which the school boards are required to follow, and that manual is not in keeping with generally accepted accounting principles. And the same goes for municipalities. So, Mr. Speaker, you can't have it both ways. You can't direct them on the one hand not to comply with GAAP, and on the other hand say, if you don't, we're going to fire your CEO. Now, here's another peculiar part. As if I've already talked about several layers of bizarreness in this particular provision of the Financial Measures Act, let me talk about another one. The government, whatever it's trying to achieve here, because we don't really know what they're trying to achieve, could accomplish exactly the same thing by writing this provision into all future employment contracts. They could issue an administrative directive and say, when you hire somebody, when you hire a CEO, you have to write this into the contract. We command you. The emperors of Hollis Street tell you that you must do this. But that's not what the government's doing. And so, Mr. Speaker, there is only one conclusion. There is only one conclusion from this because of the way the government has handled this, because of the fact, all the things I've talked about, and because they're clearly trying to rush it through with a minimum of debate by putting it in the Financial Measures Act. There is only one conclusion, and that is that there's somebody out there that they want to fire. There is somebody with an existing employment contract that they want to fire. There is no other reasonable explanation, because if that's not what they're doing, all they have to do is write this as a term into all future employment contracts. But the fact that they're rushing it through the House, the fact that there's all these layers of peculiarity about what they're trying to accomplish, it can mean only one thing. There's somebody out there the government wants to fire, but they don't want to admit, they don't want to say who it is. They don't want to say who it is. There's somebody they want, there's somebody out there right now that they've got their eye on, and they want to get rid of that person, because if that's the case, this is the only way they could do it. This is the only way they could do it. Who is that person? Well, some people said when the bill was released, or when Bill 45 was released, this must be about Jack Sullivan, the Strait Regional School Board. He's already gone. They don't need any excuse to fire him. Besides, what he did, I think or what we know of what he did, is very obviously a firing offense. They don't need to give themselves the power to fire somebody like that who's already gone. So who's the government after? Who is the government after? Mr. Speaker, I said in my remarks earlier that we accept and acknowledge that the Financial Measures Act is a matter of confidence in the government. If the Financial Measures Act is defeated, the government falls. Okay, this is part of the budget. We talk about the budget kind of loosely being the estimates, but in Nova Scotia, the budget has several parts, and one of them is the Financial Measures Act. This is the government's plan for how it's going to use its taxation power, and as such, it is a matter of confidence in the government. But I also said, Mr. Speaker, that in this environment where the government has put provisions in the bill that clearly do not belong in the bill, that have nothing to do with this budget, that have nothing to do with finance or the government's taxation power, the government should not take for granted that we will vote for every clause in this bill in Committee of the Whole House, lest the government fall. There are provisions of this bill that we believe can be extracted from the bill, if necessary. I'm not saying we've decided to do that, but we reserve the right to do that. To defeat these clauses, of course, it'll take a vote of the Liberal Party as well as our party to defeat any clause. I don't know what they're going to do. I'll listen with interest to speakers from the Liberal Party on this bill. They'll be getting up shortly, and we'll hear what their intentions are. But as for us, our message to the government on this bill, we will support it on second reading so that it can move along. We're not at the stage yet where we're ready to decide yes or no to the whole Financial Measures Act, yes or no to the budget, for the reasons that I gave in my reply to the budget. We're not ready to do that yet. So we will be supporting this bill on second reading, but the government should not take for granted that we will support every clause of this bill as it moves through Committee of the Whole House. And there are at least a couple of candidates, Mr. Speaker, for that happening. And our caucus will have to very carefully consider its position on this. And if there was one candidate for that happening, Mr. Speaker, it would be the clauses of the bill that deal with this firing of CEOs, a most peculiar thing. If the government has something they want to tell us about why this is here, well then tell us. Tell us publicly, tell us privately, it doesn't matter, but there is more going on here, Mr. Speaker, than the government is letting on, because there is no other explanation for such a bizarre piece of legislation. And if there is another candidate for some good, hard debate, it's the provisions of this bill dealing with amendments to the Education Act, and in particular with what's going on at the Southwest Regional School Board. As I mentioned the other day, Mr. Speaker, these provisions that are being amended in the Financial Measures Act have nothing to do with the budget. The provisions that are being amended were enacted in the year 2000 by an act to amend the Education Act. If it can be enacted that way, it should be amended that way. These things do not belong in the Financial Measures Act. The government has not been forthcoming with information about how the pilot project in the Southwest region has gone. And without that information, we, certainly in this party, and I may say on this side of the House, are in no position to pass judgment on whether government's doing the right thing. And so if there's a second candidate, Mr. Speaker, for defeat in Committee of the Whole House, it would be the provisions of this bill dealing with the amendments to the Education Act. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, let me say this. I have gone through in somewhat more detail than is normal on second reading with the different provisions of the bill, but of course the reason for that is that there is no coherent principle through an omnibus bill like the Financial Measures Act. The principal thing being achieved by this bill, it has to do with user fees and taxes, which is a very difficult subject, something the government has relied far too much on. Certainly the Public Accounts Committee will be interested in seeing more about the government's plans and proposals on that score next week when we have the Deputy Minister of Treasury and Policy Board before us. There are some troubling features of this bill that we make no promises on passing. And Mr. Speaker, we'll listen with interest to the debate from the Liberal Party, but this is one bill, Mr. Speaker, where it might be useful for the responsible minister to stand up and address some of these issues and concerns that I have spoken about in my remarks on second reading, because we're going to have to assume that if the government cannot offer a good explanation for these passages with which I've expressed some difficulty, we'll have to assume there is no good reason for it. And that will speak in its own way. So with that, Mr. Speaker, let me close and say I look forward to hearing the remarks of all other members of this House who choose to speak on second reading of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to rise today and speak as the finance critic for the Liberal Party on the Financial Measures Act of 2004. I've listened with great interest to the comments made previously, and I think that as a starting point, certainly this act does include all manner of changes, many of which are not financial. It in fact includes, just as an overview, changes to the debt retirement fund, or outlining it, corporate taxes. It reverses the tax cut and outlines the new tax rates. It indicates a new deadline for the public accounts. It talks about tuition support, a change in governance in school boards. It reverses or cancels any increase in the MLA's pays related to the study that was recently done, and it touches on user fees and taxes. And that's to name just a few. There are, in fact, 21 different acts that are amended through this Financial Measures Act. And I found a lot of it to be semantics, a lot of it to be just the fee changes going from one fee to another, some of it structural changes, and some of them actually talking about new programs such as the tuition agreements that will come into place. So basically it captures everything but the kitchen sink, I think we could say, or use the word omnibus bill. It's very broad, and there's a great deal that can be said about it. I think that it's important that we do go through it in great detail because of the fact that there's every opportunity for things to be not deliberately hidden, but because of the depth of it, that they could in fact be overlooked. So I think it's really important that all members of the opposition go through it with a fine-tooth comb and pay a great deal of attention to each of the acts that are changed. One thing that is different this year is that to defeat this bill could in fact trigger the fall of a government, that this bill goes, as was pointed out, hand in hand with the budget. And so it is important for members of the government side to recognize that once the budget passes, this government is not entirely out of the woods. If anything is hidden in the budget that is not disclosed by government during estimates, we will get a second crack at this bill. And I urge the governing members to take this into consideration when we are discussing and asking questions during estimates. I wanted to cover the issue of user fees because there's a great number of them in this act. As you go through, as I mentioned, there's many of them, and they have to be referenced back to the act in which they come from. But you know, as was asked, a number of questions asked lately in question period, it's very clear that the Supreme Court of Canada has said that user fees must be simply cost recovery. They must relate to the cost of providing a service for government. And if they go beyond that, they are in fact taxes and need to be fully disclosed and dealt with differently here in the House. So although we heard on March 30th, I believe it was, the introduction of many new taxes or user fees, 508 to be exact, we have, in fact, seen a number of them acknowledged here to be more than user fees, but to, in fact, be taxes. And I think that's very important because it speaks to the clarity and it speaks to the transparency of government, whether or not people are aware of what's being done and how things are couched. The wording that we use is very important for whether or not the public fully understands what's being done in very important matters that affect the costs of doing business, the costs of living in a community, the costs of running a car, registering a car, and so on. There's so many fees and taxes that we're faced with daily that it's important to be clear and upfront in all of those cases. And although it may seem a massive task to go through and itemize and explain 508 new fees or taxes, it's really important that that system be put into place and begin now, and that the departments that are responsible for these individual taxes and fees take responsibility and begin to just improve the integrity of the user fee and tax system so that people have greater confidence and greater trust in government as these changes are made. In fact, you know, when these changes came in, the minister was interviewed on a show and said that in fact, yes, most of them were 6.5% on average and were cost recovery. And I asked that question recently, actually I think it was April 20th in the House. I have just a copy of the answer here, but the answer I got when I asked that the calculations be provided, the Minister of Finance answered me that some of those fees will be addressed in the Financial Measures Act, which we do see here today, although I would suggest that not very many are indicated here as taxes out of 508. And he goes on to say, which will be tabled in the House in the next few days, some of those fees were just done through regulations, but we can indicate, as I indicated at the time of the fees, those were just cost of living adjustments to enable us to provide the service Nova Scotians want at a reasonable rate and fee. And although that is what the minister has said, I feel that there's a great number of them that are not accounted for fully, and that should really, you know, the information for that should be brought back here. And perhaps we'll learn more about that when we do discuss user fees at the upcoming Public Accounts Committee. But I think it's very important that we dwell on that and really look at the integrity of the system that's in place right now. In fact, since 2000, it would appear that, since the year 2000, it would appear that with all the user fee increases, we're up to about $230 million a year in additional revenues that are being collected by the province. So this is much larger than the $12 million that we're talking about right now. I mean, the latest round of user fees, the 508 user fees that were just increased, amount to about $12 million annually in revenue. But consider that in the context of user fees that have gone up since 2000, and that is a total of $230 million per year. So basically what we're doing in this bill by identifying certain of those user fees that are clearly taxes, according to the Minister of Justice, we're simply protecting ourselves from any court challenges, and I think that that is important because we don't want to leave the province exposed. But better to analyze it in the first place and make these changes in a more structured manner. I think it's very important to note, and I realize we were at the start of a new fiscal year, but these user fees were announced in a big block en masse at the very end of one fiscal year. So done in such a way that once again, because of the enormity of the number of fees we were looking at, it's very difficult to zero in and really analyze and understand the implications of each and every one. And some of them do have some very negative implications to either business or individuals. So I think that it makes it more difficult, and perhaps that is not such a bad thing, but it keeps the opposition very busy in trying to analyze and understand all the implications of those changes. And so I've done that. Okay, let's see. Now, in the months since the election in August, which was my arrival here in the legislature, the finance minister has held a couple of briefings for members of the opposition, and that was done at our request. That now we have a new system in place. We have a minority government. I think the public genuinely expects that in a minority government, all of the parties involved will have a voice and will have some influence. And it was accepted by the Minister of Finance that, yes, indeed, we would have some advanced briefings before some announcements were made. But those have really been very few and far between. Certainly in September, and again in December, we had an advanced look at the quarterly reports as they were coming out. But that advance warning was only a matter of less than an hour before the figures and the position was made public through a press conference. So I would have to say that level of consultation is extremely superficial. The gesture is appreciated, but it really has not gone far enough, and I think that the members of the opposition would agree that we need to have a greater dialogue, because it's very difficult to expect support on measures that will cost new resources, or on new measures to restructure government in any way, when we're not fully apprised of the situation in government. If we don't know fully the cost, if we don't know fully the situation as the year is unfolding, it's very difficult for us to provide support for whatever measures are being suggested here in the House. One of the things that the government did fail to disclose, and was pointed out again by the Auditor General in his November 14th report, and it is very significant, was some of the lack of clarity. I use that word rather loosely. I guess we could say lack of transparency that the government provided for changes that were being made to certain accounting practices. And it has to be noted that although these practices conform to generally accepted accounting principles, their adoption and the timing of their adoption was very much created favorable conditions by and large for the government and for the reporting of the provincial records. But one thing that didn't was the addition of $500 million to our debt. And the debt shot up because of a change in accounting rules primarily. But that was well known. That change had been studied. In fact, the Auditor General was calling for that change. It should have been adopted, at some point anyway. But when the debt management plan was announced, as we've heard earlier today, when that plan was announced in late June or mid-June, it was fully known to the government that change was coming, and that the debt would go up by a substantial amount, by $500 million, $500 million, and at the same time, those figures were not disclosed, and it made the debt management plan look that much more rosy. The plan itself, coming as it did on the very eve of an election, and really because it was one plank or one piece of the puzzle that had been promised by the government and never delivered. So with an election looming, the government scurried, pulled together the pieces, announced a debt management plan, but didn't come fully clean in terms of telling us entirely what the implications were going to be, knowing that this accounting change was just around the corner. In fact, just 2 weeks around the corner, and again announced on the eve of a long weekend where it would attract very little attention. So those sort of things have left a distinct atmosphere of certainly caution and perhaps distrust in terms of our relationship with the government, because those things they're not up front, and they're not straightforward, and they're not really being fully accountable to the public. We would like to make the demand that the government begin to pay more than lip service to our demands for fuller inquiries and for fuller information, so that we can begin to play a larger role in the measures that are before us, and even in terms of support for the budget. Because it is very difficult where the balance does lie with the opposition parties to pass that budget if we don't have the cooperation of government. It's certainly been in short supply this spring, in spite of government spin to the contrary. I wanted to go a little bit into some of the stage that we're at. Since I have the opportunity today, and I'm being given the time to speak to the Financial Measures Act, one of the very favorite charts that we're seeing lately by the government, and I'll table this for you, but it's in the budget highlights, so it's something that the members of the House have received. But it's a chart that shows the differential between the provincial and the federal debt, or not debt, I'm sorry, the income, the revenue that we receive from our own source revenues within the province, and those that are generated or received through transfer payments, either for health and social services or for equalization. And the point that's been made a number of times by the Premier and by other members of the government, and in fact he had a large chart like this behind him when he announced the reversal of the tax cut, as part of his rationale for blaming Ottawa for the fact that he had to reverse the position on the tax cut. Part of the reason he does that is because there's a large differential between our own source revenue and our government revenue. But what should be remembered is the sharp rise in our own source revenue, the fact that Nova Scotians, more of them are working, more of them are paying taxes, and more companies are profitable and doing well. That means we've generated more money. And in fact, for our own coffers, we've generated an extra $1 billion from 2000 to this expected year 04-05. And that's very clear in the chart right here in our budget highlights. And that is a very positive thing. $1 billion more available to this government to service our debt and provide the many services that the public requires, the many departments that we're going through one by one, line item by line item. We're doing that, looking very carefully at the services that government provides to Nova Scotians. And many of those are very important, very essential. In fact, I would venture to say they all are. And I realize the challenge for government is setting priorities and being able to balance them. But I don't think it's fair to take that chart that shows that the government revenues have gone up to just about $2 billion and that our own source revenues have risen to $4 billion and say that there's anything wrong with that, because that shows a greater capacity within Nova Scotia that we should be relying upon ourselves a lot more. The spread actually indicates increased prosperity. And I think that needs to be mentioned. And again, even if we want to look simply at Ottawa and how much money comes from the federal government, we see it has increased in the last number of years. And just to speak briefly to the volatility of the equalization payments, which I know is a subject of great debate among members of the government, the equalization formula has been set for many years. It's well known to the government that if our provinces that are richer and have larger economies don't do well, there's less money in the pot to distribute to those provinces that receive equalization payments. And given the news throughout the summer of SARS and forest fires and difficulties with BSE and our cattle industry, it was well known that there would be less profitability, less money in the pot for distribution among all of the provinces that receive money, and Nova Scotia is among them. So it was not an unexpected thing, and I think that the tone of the government in blaming Ottawa for these things, it should be balanced with the fact that it was not unexpected, it was predictable. And the fact that there is volatility in that formula is a problem, and the formula does need to be amended so that some of those bumps can be taken out and the sharp increases or decreases that you might benefit or suffer from can be removed. But the formula has been well known and set for a long time. So I think that we can't go around just referring to that alone. In your own corporate plan, which came out in January 16th, 2004, the same chart is given again with a little more detail. But again, it shows the same thing, that the revenues are up by $1 billion, and in fact, government money from the federal government is increasing. So I'm kind of tired of that argument coming from government that we haven't. There's no recognition of the fact that we have an increased capacity to pay our bills and to look after our people. And I really have to say that there's been a failure on the part of the Conservative government to, 5 years after your mandate began, to still be complaining about these kind of factors when you've enjoyed 5 of the best years that have come to Nova Scotia in many, many years. And you have enjoyed the benefit of spending large amounts of capital projects related to the oil industry, new people coming on board, moving to our province and spending and contributing to our province. And I think that it's been very good times, and it's kind of a sad commentary that we're at this point in time still complaining about an inability to fund our activities and to look after the basic needs of some people in our society. So I don't think it's a very, in fact, I would say it's a poor record for the Conservative government to have to live by. So the ordinary revenues that we generate ourselves are very significantly up, and I think that that's the point that has to be made there. Another, and again, just in the general sense of how this budget goes, I guess, in setting the stage for this budget, we were given as well during the budget presentation a little small briefing of budget highlights, essentially. And one of the very first things that jumped out at me in that budget highlight, which is in the very, very top of it, and once again, Mr. Speaker, everybody has a copy of this, so I could table it, but everybody has that copy. In the very beginning on the budget summary, it shows our ordinary revenues and it shows our net program expenses. And in the figures there, it provides the percentage change. And what it shows is that our ordinary revenues are projected to be up by 4.2% this year, but our net program expenses are rising faster. They're rising at 5.4%. And the same thing was true last year when we compared this to the same chart in last year's budget highlights. So that is a continuing trend where our ordinary revenues and the increase in them is not matching the increases that are being seen in our program expenses. And that's simply not sustainable in the long run. And that doesn't even take into account capital projects and new debt that will be adding to this. It simply indicates in a nutshell that we can't afford the way we're currently growing and spending our money. So there isn't a balance between the growth in what we're spending and the growth in our revenues that are available to us. And so it is a concern to me, and it should be to Nova Scotia.
Now, Member Halifax, Clayton Park is the floor.
Mr. Speaker. As I say, I think it points very strongly to whether or not there is sustainability in the balance in our financial house here in Nova Scotia, and some real concerns there. Another point that I'd like to raise in this, since it's part of the overview of the budget, is the expected revenues that we're looking at from a number of sources, which I think, again, just point to some aspects of the budget that may be a little bit not just unsustainable, but unrealistic. And that would be primarily the growth that is expected in retail sales. This year, it's expected that our retail sales will grow from 2003 being only less than 1%. It was 0.8% growth. And we're expecting now that suddenly that will recover and grow to 4.5% in this year, 2004, 2005. And that just doesn't seem realistic to me if we've gone from less than 1%, that we're suddenly going to have some major influx of capital or money that's going to create that bump in spending. And when I questioned the finance department officials about that, I was told that it's related to recovery in the American markets. And I think, again, that's very unpredictable and very volatile, because their economists in the United States are disagreeing right now about where their economy is going, because they've had what looked like a recovery, and then 6 months later it's crashed and hasn't followed the normal process. And also the spending and the way the government's behaving in the United States is very precarious. They're actually looking at a deficit this year of something in the range of $1 trillion. And to run an economy in that way is very unsustainable as well, and I don't think that it has actually had the impact that they hoped. Now, I would hope that there are great sales in the U.S. and that they buy lots of our products, which pumps more money into Nova Scotia, and then as a result we will see some big increase in retail sales, hopefully in the range of 4 or 5%. But I just think that we have to be very cautious in planning these kind or estimating what kind of revenue we'll be able to generate, because we have to live within that through the year. And if it doesn't materialize, we're going to be faced with the same problems we had this year, which is getting partway into the year and starting to have to make cuts in our programs or defer spending challenging or create greater hardship for Nova Scotians. And that's not where we want to be as the year progresses. So it's better to start out, I think, with an estimate that's realistic and cautious rather than overestimating. Another one, just by way of interest, that we've overestimated, I believe, would be the increase in our revenue from the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission. We're looking at what would amounts to just over a 9% increase in revenue profit or revenue from the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission, and that is not substantiated in any way. And I don't at all expect that Nova Scotians will be consuming 9% more alcohol. And I would hope that we're not looking at some huge increases in taxes or cost of that product. We haven't heard anything to that effect, but something is leading the economists or the forecasters in the estimate to put an increase of 9% on the profits for Nova Scotia Liquor Commission. And again, we heard today that they've hired new people and they're expanding their communications department and doing other things, so I don't think there's belt tightening going on that end either. So something is amiss, I think, in terms of putting that much emphasis on the sales from Nova Scotia Liquor Commission. I would say that just as a way of caution, I had a look at the Gaming Corporation, and their revenues are expected to be flat and the same as last year, which I thought was good because I wouldn't want to think that we were expecting a great deal of more gambling in that sense. So those are some of my concerns in terms of the general, just the background and setting the stage for this current Financial Measures Act and the budget that's before us as well. In the debt management plan, there's a large section in this Financial Measures Act that deals with debt and how you're going to enshrine the debt management plan that was announced in June now into the legislation and make it law. It's probably a good thing to put it in legislation simply to formalize it. I think that is better than just a road show, essentially, which you might describe the original press release as, because there was a press conference held, and I think it was mentioned, unfortunately I wasn't there last June, but it was mentioned that it was to great fanfare that the debt management plan was announced. And again, I would say that members of the opposition had raised the issue that this government had no plan for retiring debt, and that was one of the major gaps in the entire financial management of the province. And so it was done on the fly. I think it was done definitely in haste in order to prepare for an election and feel that all your ducks were in order, Mr. Speaker. However, I think it's a good thing that we have a plan. This opposition party, our Liberal Party, has criticized the government for not having a better plan for spending in health care, for example. We've said it's one thing to put money in, but you need to plan. So it's good that a debt management plan has been formulated, but I have some doubts about how well it can actually be implemented. And some of the figures that we've talked about for this year alone would be to put $10 million away through two different funds, a debt retirement fund and a debt contingency, retirement contingency fund, but essentially putting $10 million aside this year in the hopes of this fund growing to a point where you could actually put, I believe it's $70 million down on the debt. But the debt is continuing to grow from now until 2007, I believe it is. I'm just going to have a look here in our estimates, if I can go to that. Very good. Actually, when I looked at the original press release for the debt reduction plan, which came out June 11th, it pretty much follows exactly what we see in our estimates given. I have the chart, which it's Schedule 20 of the financial year. So it's the Nova Scotia budget for the financial year. It's pretty light, small one, but it's the last chart in that book, and it's Schedule 20. It does outline there how the hoped for surpluses from year to year, each annual surplus, if they materialize, will over time lead to having $106 million, it says, in the debt retirement plan, which can then go against the debt and hopefully also cover all the capital purchases. And I think that this is highly optimistic, because in order to actually retire any debt, you also have to get control of the increase each year in the net book value of our capital assets. And that's going to be very difficult to do, Mr. Speaker. It's not that I'm not hopeful that it could be done, but I just don't feel that it's very sustainable when you actually look at what we're hoping to achieve in those few years. I think it is good to mention that the debt rose so dramatically under the Conservative government of John Buchanan and left this province really crippled. And in the early 90s, there's no question that this province was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was crippled financially. We have recovered significantly in that time, but this is the burden that we're left to carry, and that's the debt that we're still asked and probably for generations will be asked to manage. This volume 2 of the financial statements shows that the debt servicing cost in 2003, which is the most recent year available, was in fact a full $1,079,000,000. So in that year alone, it exceeded the $1 billion mark, which is a shocking amount of money to come out of our treasury, essentially, and not be spent on important services for Nova Scotians. And I think while we're talking about debt and the debt management plan, you really can't speak about that without looking at that debt servicing cost. That amounts to over $1 billion a year. The money we spend for interest payments and on the debt is money that isn't available for education, for university students, for health, for our seniors, and for the many others who depend on government services. And all of us as MLAs, I know in our constituencies, deal with many, many calls. I'm as a new MLA, learning more about that, but many calls coming in from people who have difficulty accessing certain health care services, home care, maybe it's community services. I receive a lot of calls on the community service side. And these people are trying to live on very little, and it's almost impossible for them to maintain their lives. And that's because we don't have the money in this province to anywhere near match what's available in other provinces. And in some of the healthcare areas, we're unable to afford services. We again and again come up as the lowest in terms of the services we provide to our people. In fact, the alternative budget put out by the Canadian, Paul, what is it called? The alternative provincial budget, which was published recently by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, said that we have the lowest per capita spending on programs of any province in the country. And that just mirrors what we hear again and again, that we have the worst indicators for so many things. Our debt per capita, being so high, our provincial debt being among the highest, our health indicators being among the lowest, and our spending on our people per capita the lowest in Canada. So we have a tremendous need to improve our performance in the situation we're in, and the debt levels that we carry make it very, very difficult for us to help those people who call and say that they can't live either because of their disability or infirmity, they can't live on the money that's available to them. And so that's a sorry thing to say about Nova Scotia, which is a province that we all love, and I think we're all very proud to be from and live in. And I think all of us are, I'm sure, regardless of any party politics, are very, disturbed to see that that's the situation in Nova Scotia today. So there's an awful lot of need to do something about debt, and I don't want to minimize the need for us to act on it. But this debt will only stop growing in 3 years' time if everything goes according to plan, and the plan has just so many ifs. Right now, we can't even deal with this year's budget without wondering whether, with a million different factors that could alter by just a fraction, we won't hit any kind of a surplus either. We're talking about a razor-thin surplus that's estimated at $2.1 million on a budget of over $6 billion. So there are so many uncertainties, and when you start to try and look down the road to see that we could, to even imagine that we could have enough money in that debt retirement fund, that we could find an extra $70 million a year to put into that debt retirement fund, is pretty hard to imagine. So I think that leaves us with a lot of concerns. Mr. Speaker, the whole debt management exercise really does look like a public relations exercise, and I wish I had been there last June, because I think it would be even more clear to me had I been there at the press conference when it was all unveiled. And it's a telling thing when there are so many pressing needs and so little ability to do it. The reality is that in order to attain this plan, the government will have to attain surpluses that are big enough to offset the borrowing for tangible capital assets, which means our roads and our school projects, etc. And that's a significant amount of money. And in fact, in the year that we're looking at beginning retiring debt, 2007-8, we're up to $86.8 million. So we'd have to have that kind of a surplus in order to even begin to retire any debt. So, as I say, we're hopeful. certainly we support the idea of a plan, and so I don't want to belittle the idea that we are planning. I just feel that it's an enormous task before us. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to speak a little bit about the tax cut that was before us as well. I think I'll go on to economic growth. We'll talk about that. I think the government side has been tired of hearing about the tax cut, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the revenue side of the ledger and economic growth, because another part of this bill talks about certain measures, certain taxes and fees and so on. But what is difficult is that really the government has failed to address certain measures that could grow our economy. The only way that the government is going to be able to attain the surplus that we talked about, the need to continue that tremendous growth that you have enjoyed, the $1 billion extra in own source revenue, is to grow the economy and to see that some of the sectors that are slowing down, we need to either replace them with another sector or find some new measure or new method to raise money. So it's very important to continue to look at the revenue side and the economy of Nova Scotia. So as I said, I believe that this budget really has failed to consider any measures that will grow our economy. The only way that we'll get the surplus we need is to do just that. There is nothing in this bill that addresses it, and nothing that I see in the budget. There were no measures to improve rural economic development or to stimulate business or the economy. In fact, there are portions of this bill, the Financial Measures Act, which will in fact slow the economy. In particular, the large corporations' capital tax will have a negative effect on investment. Companies will not be willing to invest here if, in fact, it's cheaper for them to go elsewhere, and especially even in Atlantic Canada. A lot of our largest employers are companies that have got operations in the States or elsewhere in the world or across Canada. I think of the Michelins or Bowater or Story, and so all of those have other operations that they could choose to invest in. And what we've done by increasing the capital tax for corporations is we've punished those firms, because if they want to invest here to upgrade, to create better facilities, more efficient manufacturing facilities, they actually have to pay a larger tax here than they would in New Brunswick or in other jurisdictions. So we've created not a level playing field. We've had this tax, which should have been removed anyway 2 years ago, according to the original agreement. We've now not only extended it, we've increased it. And that means that it's not a level playing field. It's a penalty on companies or employers that want to improve their facilities here, expand, and hire more Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, I had a press release from the Canadian manufacturers and exporters that I'd like to refer to if I could. The Canadian manufacturers and exporters in Nova Scotia alone, their employers employ over 50,000 people. That's in their press release. It's quite a staggering number to think of. I had spoken of them as an organization who employed thousands of people, but 50,000 employees in Nova Scotia, employed by the 1,400 members of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association. And in their press release, which was sent out April 22nd, in relation to the budget, they do state very clearly, and I'll just quote from Kent McIntyre, who's the chair of the CME in Nova Scotia. He stated, "I'm extremely disappointed with the increase in the large corporations tax, which should have been phased out 2 years ago. CME members who are part of the 1,400 corporations being taxed will have to bear a major part of the extra $12.6 million being collected." So you can see that that's going to hit a very small number of employers. Yes, they're large corporations, but in fact, if they lose confidence or lose heart in expanding and employing more people in Nova Scotia, that has a devastating effect on our economy. Yeah. Now, at the same time, the small business sector is getting a small increase in the threshold they're receiving, but discussions with the Canadian Federation of Small Business indicated that this was a change that was coming anyway. It's just been advanced slightly, and really very few companies will benefit on the small business side. It's a good gesture, but it's not going to cost Nova Scotia very much money in terms of our budget, and so it's more of a gesture. Again, it's a little bit of lip service to small business. But I think it's really important that we consider the impact in many of our communities. And a lot of these very large employers are not here in Halifax. They're actually around the province.
Order, please. Do the laid up. Order, please. Due to the hour, would the honourable member like to move adjournment debate, please?
Yes, I'd be happy to move adjournment
Motion
of
is
debate.
adjourn
Thank
debate.
you.
Is the House agreed? The honourable government House Leader on tomorrow's hours and order of business.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now rise to meet again on the morrow at the hour of 9 a.m. The House will, the business of the day will be Committee of the Whole House on Supply. And when we've completed 4 hours of deliberations in committee, we will adjourn for the day. Thank you, Mr.
Motion
Speaker.
is the House adjourned to 9 a.m. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary minded nay. Motion is carried. The House is adjourned to 9 a.m.